You're standing in your kitchen making coffee on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nothing unusual happening, when out of nowhere your mind drops you back into a moment from 15 years ago, a conversation you handled badly, a decision you made too quickly, a door you closed that you sometimes wonder about even now. The coffee keeps brewing. Your hand is still on the counter, but some other part of you is standing in a room that doesn't exist anymore, talking to a person who's aged 15 years since then, replaying a version of events you've replayed so many times you're no longer sure how much of it is memory and how much is just the story you've built on top of it. You didn't ask for this. It arrived uninvited, the way it always does, and for the next several minutes, an ordinary Tuesday quietly becomes a courtroom you never agreed to sit in. There's a reason this keeps happening, and it isn't that you're stuck, or weak, or somehow failing to move on the way other people apparently manage to. It's that no one ever taught you the difference between learning from your past and being sentenced by it. Notice the strangeness of it, once you actually slow down enough to look at it clearly. The conversation you're replaying ended a decade and a half ago. Every person in it has changed. You've changed. The circumstances that shaped that moment no longer exist in any form, and yet your nervous system responds as though the stakes were still live, as though something in that scene were still waiting to be resolved, still capable of going differently if only you could find the right angle to approach it from this time. You never do find that angle, because there isn't one. The scene is finished. It finished the moment it happened. What's running now isn't the event itself. It's a recording, watched so many times the tape has worn thin, and somehow still commanding your full attention every single time it plays. You didn't choose this habit. Almost no one does. It builds slowly, often starting with a single moment that genuinely deserved some reflection, a mistake worth understanding so you wouldn't repeat it. But somewhere along the way, useful reflection quietly curdled into something else, a loop that runs on its own schedule now, triggered by nothing in particular, offering no new information each time it plays, just the same scene, the same regret, the same quiet verdict against yourself, delivered again and again as though repetition alone might eventually produce a different outcome. It never does. The past doesn't change no matter how many times you revisit it, only your mood does, and usually not for the better. Sometimes it isn't a name or a place that triggers it, just an ordinary quiet moment with nothing to fill it, a long drive, a wait in a doctor's office, the last few minutes before falling asleep. In the absence of anything else demanding your attention, the mind often defaults to whatever unfinished business it's been quietly carrying, and for a great many people, that unfinished business is some version of the same handful of old regrets, replayed with remarkable fidelity, right down to the exact words that were said or the exact words that weren't. You can go weeks without consciously thinking about a particular decision, and then find yourself, without warning, fully back inside it during a 2-minute elevator ride, as though no time had passed at all. Picture a specific version of this. You're at a family gathering, relaxed, enjoying yourself when someone mentions a city or a job or a name that happens to connect, however loosely, to a choice you made decades ago that didn't turn out the way you'd hope. In an instant, you're gone, mentally, standing somewhere in the past, running the old what if again. What if you'd taken that other job, stayed in that other city, said yes instead of no, or no instead of yes? The conversation around you continues. Someone asks you a question and you answer a beat too late, distracted, only half present, because some part of you is still negotiating with a decision that was finalized before your children, if you have them, were even born. This is what unresolved regret actually costs. Not the original mistake, which is long since over, but the ongoing tax it quietly charges against every present moment it manages to hijack. Multiply that single missed beat, that single half-present moment, across a lifetime of similar triggers, and the total cost becomes considerably larger than it feels in any single instance. A grandchild says something funny and you almost miss it because you're 3 sentences into an old argument that ended before they were born. A partner asks how your day was and gets an answer half-formed around whatever old scene just resurfaced during the drive home. None of these moments look dramatic from the outside. No one else in the room usually even notices you've left. But you notice, eventually, when you add up how much of your actual life has been quietly attended by only half of you, the other half still stationed somewhere in a room that stopped existing years ago. Here's the idea worth sitting with until it actually changes something. Regret, past a certain point, isn't remembering. It's spending currency you don't have on a debt that already closed. The moment is over. It closed the instant it happened, sealed permanently the second the next moment began, and no amount of mental revisiting reopens it, changes it, or produces a different outcome. What regret actually does, when it runs past its useful lifespan, is borrow suffering from your present and spend it on a past that can no longer be edited. No matter how carefully or how often you go back over it, you are, quite literally, paying today's currency for yesterday's already finished transaction, and the exchange rate is terrible. This doesn't mean the past should be ignored entirely, or that reflection has no value. There's a real and useful difference between visiting a memory long enough to extract something from it, a lesson, a boundary, a piece of self-knowledge, and living inside that memory indefinitely, long after it has anything left to teach. The first is reflection, the second is rumination, and the two feel almost identical from the inside, which is exactly why so many people mistake one for the other for years, sometimes decades, without ever noticing the switch happened. Marcus Aurelius understood something about this that feels almost startlingly modern given how long ago he wrote it. He reminded himself in notes never meant for anyone else to read, that a person's life is really only ever the present moment, a fleeting instant, because the past is gone and the future is uncertain, and each of us only ever actually possesses the sliver we're standing in right now. He wasn't saying the past doesn't matter or that it shouldn't inform your choices going forward. He was pointing out something more precise, that spending today grieving a moment that no longer technically exists anywhere except inside your own memory is a strange kind of self-imposed exile from the only time you're actually able to act, choose, or live. The past isn't a place you can return to and fix. It's a story your mind keeps rendering, in increasingly worn detail, long after the original event has finished happening. There's something worth noticing in how he actually lived out this idea, not just wrote about it. He governed during years marked by plague, war, and repeated betrayal, any one of which could have justified endless dwelling on what might have gone differently, what he might have done sooner, what might have been prevented. Instead, his private notes return again and again to the same discipline, confining his attention to the task actually in front of him, the decision actually available to him today, rather than the ones already closed behind him. He wasn't naturally immune to regret. He practiced not dwelling in it deliberately, as a discipline, the same way you might practice anything else worth doing well. Seneca pushed on this from a slightly different angle, writing that life is long enough for those who use it well, but that so much of it gets wasted, not through some external theft but through our own hands, spent on anxious anticipation of a future we can't control or aching over a past we can't revise. He described people who live as though they have two lives, the one actually happening and the one they're constantly mentally rehearsing in some other time frame, and pointed out that the second life, the one spent revisiting old decisions or dreading imagined ones, consumes hours and years that never get returned. He wasn't cold about this. He understood grief, understood real loss, and wasn't arguing for a kind of forced indifference toward your own history. He was simply naming a pattern he saw clearly in himself and in nearly everyone around him. That regret, left unchecked, doesn't shrink over time the way a wound naturally heals. It simply keeps drawing from an account that was never going to refill itself, quietly overdrawn a little more with every replay, until years have passed and the balance owed has grown far larger than the original mistake could ever have justified. Think about what this looks like in practice for an ordinary person, not an emperor or a philosopher advising one. Someone might spend an entire retirement quietly replaying a career decision made 30 years earlier, wondering what a different path might have produced, running the alternate version of their life almost like a second job they never applied for and never get paid for. Meanwhile, actual years of an actual present life, grandchildren, hobbies, mornings that could hold real enjoyment, pass by only partially attended to, because so much daily bandwidth is quietly reserved for a decision that finished being relevant decades ago. Seneca would say this person has, in effect, been living two lives at once, and only one of them was ever actually available to be lived well. Epictetus offered the clearest possible tool for sorting this out. Some things fall within your control, he taught, and some things fall entirely outside it, and almost nothing produces more needless suffering than confusing which category something belongs to. The past belongs permanently and without exception to the category of things outside your control. It happened, it's finished. No decision you make today reaches backward and touches it. What remains within your control, every single time, is what you do with today right now, in whatever moment you're actually standing in. Treating the unchangeable past as though it were still somehow negotiable, still somehow able to be different if you just think about it hard enough or long enough, guarantees a particular kind of exhausting frustration, the same frustration you'd feel arguing with weather, except the weather, at least, eventually changes on its own. Epictetus would likely have found the mental habit of arguing with a closed decision almost absurd once it was stated plainly, in the same category as demanding that yesterday's rain fall differently in hindsight. And yet he understood exactly why the habit persists, because the mind, when faced with pain it can't currently do anything about, often prefers the illusion of working on the problem over the discomfort of accepting there's nothing left to work on. Replaying an old regret can feel, in the moment, like productive effort, like you're doing something about it. Epictetus's point cuts directly against that illusion. The feeling of effort isn't the same as effort actually landing anywhere useful, and mistaking one for the other is exactly how years get spent circling a closed door. There's a companion idea in Buddhist teaching worth including here, built around the image of a raft. A traveler builds a raft to cross a dangerous river, and the raft serves its purpose beautifully, carrying them safely to the other side. But once they've crossed, if they insist on carrying the raft with them everywhere afterward, dragging it up mountains, hauling it through forests, it stops being useful and becomes only a burden, heavy and pointless, disconnected from the purpose it once served. Regret often works the same way. At some point, usually fairly early, it did its job, teaching a lesson worth learning, prompting a change worth making. Past that point, carrying it further doesn't protect you from anything. It only weighs down every present moment with a burden that already finished its actual purpose long ago. Recognizing when you've crossed that river is its own small skill, worth developing deliberately rather than leaving to chance. A useful test is asking whether returning to the memory today produces anything genuinely new, a fresh insight, a changed perspective, a piece of understanding you didn't already have. If the answer is no, if it's the same scene, the same lesson already absorbed, the same verdict already delivered 100 times before, that's usually a clear sign the raft has done its work and is now simply being carried out of habit rather than necessity. There's a well-documented psychological pattern underneath all of this, studied extensively by the psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema under the name rumination, the tendency to repetitively focus on distressing events and their possible causes and consequences, rather than moving toward resolution or action. Her research found something worth sitting with, that rumination doesn't actually help people process difficult experiences the way it seems like it should. It tends to do the opposite, prolonging low mood, increasing the sense of being stuck, and making it harder, not easier, to actually solve whatever problem originally triggered the reflection. The mind believes quite sincerely that going over the old decision one more time might finally produce clarity or resolution. In practice, it almost never does. It simply produces one more replay, indistinguishable from the last, and a slightly heavier mood to carry into the rest of the day. Nolan Hoeksema's research also identified something particularly relevant here, a distinction between what she called reflective pondering, a genuinely curious problem-solving orientation toward a difficult experience, and brooding, a passive, repetitive dwelling that compares the current situation unfavorably to some unmet standard without moving toward resolution. Reflective pondering tends to actually help, producing insight and eventually a sense of closure. Brooding tends to trap people in place, sometimes for years, precisely because it feels like thinking, feels like processing, while functionally producing nothing new each time it runs. The difference isn't always obvious from the inside in the moment. It usually becomes obvious only in hindsight, measured by whether a particular cycle of thinking about the past ever actually arrived anywhere, or simply looped back to its own starting point again and again. So here's a practice for the exact moment the old loop starts running, the instant you notice yourself pulled backward into a decision or moment you can no longer change. Pause and ask yourself one clarifying question: can this decision still be made differently right now, in this actual moment? If the honest answer is no, and for most regrets rooted in the genuine past, it almost always is no, that's your signal to redirect, gently, without harshness, back toward whatever is actually in front of you. You're not suppressing the memory or pretending it doesn't matter. You're simply recognizing that no further mental effort spent on it right now will change anything, and redirecting that same energy towards something that still has room to be shaped. Try this the next time an old memory surfaces uninvited. Say you're driving and a song comes on that instantly drops you into a decision you made years ago that still stings a little. Before the loop runs its full course, ask the question: can this still be made differently right now? The honest answer is almost always no. The decision closed long ago. The moment sealed the second it passed. Once you've named that clearly, even just internally, you can let the memory pass through rather than settle in. The way you'd let a wave move past you rather than trying to hold it in place with your bare hands. Or say the old memory shows up in the middle of a conversation with a close friend, triggered by something small they mentioned in passing. Rather than disappearing into it mid-sentence, run the same question silently: can this still be made differently right now? The answer, again, is almost always no. But notice what the question also does in that specific moment. It hands you back the conversation you were actually in, the person actually in front of you, rather than losing another few minutes to a scene that finished playing out long before this particular friendship even began. For the deeper, recurring version of this pattern, a longer exercise works better than a single pause in the moment. Take 15 quiet minutes and write down the 2 or 3 regrets that surface most often in your mind. Next to each one, write down honestly what you actually learned from it, however small or obvious that lesson might feel written out plainly. Then, in a separate column, write down what remains genuinely within your control today, related to that same regret, whether that's a relationship you could still repair, a habit you could still change, or simply a kinder way of holding the memory going forward. Reading these columns side by side often reveals something useful, that the lesson was usually absorbed years ago, and what's left running isn't actually learning anymore. It's just the loop itself, disconnected from any remaining purpose. Keep this list somewhere you'll return to, and revisit it every month or two rather than treating it as a one-time exercise. Over several passes, most people notice the same 2 or 3 regrets showing up again and again, largely unchanged, which is itself useful information, a clear signal that the loop has stopped serving any learning function and has simply become habitual. Once you can name a regret specifically as belonging to that category, fully learned from, nothing further to extract, you can meet its next appearance with something closer to recognition than dread, a familiar visitor rather than an ambush. Turn the evening version of this into a small nightly habit, 5 or 10 honest minutes before sleep, done in the same quiet spot each night so it becomes something your mind starts to expect rather than resist. Ask yourself whether any part of today was quietly spent revisiting something from years ago rather than fully present with what was actually in front of you. Ask what that old memory might have been trying to teach you, and whether you've already learned it, even if some part of you keeps insisting on relearning it nightly. Ask what it would feel like to set the memory down tonight, not forgotten, just no longer carried as an active weight. And ask gently what you want tomorrow to actually be about, given that it's the only version of time you'll ever have any real influence over. These questions rarely resolve everything in a single sitting, and they don't need to. Their value builds through repetition, slowly teaching the mind that the loop can be interrupted rather than simply endured. Underneath all of this sits a root cause worth naming clearly, even though it's uncomfortable to look at directly. For many people, ongoing regret isn't really about the original decision at all, not fundamentally. It's about an old, unspoken belief that continued suffering is somehow owed, that if you stop replaying the mistake, you're somehow letting yourself off too easily, as though ongoing guilt were the price of having once done something wrong. This belief rarely gets stated outright, but it runs quietly underneath a great deal of unresolved regret, the sense that moving on would be a kind of moral failure rather than simply a return to living. Naming this directly tends to loosen its grip considerably, because once you can see that you've been unconsciously punishing yourself long past any point of usefulness, you can start asking whether that punishment is actually serving anyone, including the people you may have once affected by the original decision. Consider what this actually looks like in practice. Someone who once said something unkind to a parent shortly before that parent passed away might carry that moment for decades, replaying it with a kind of ritual regularity, as if the replaying itself were a form of penance still owed. But the parent isn't made any less loved by the replaying, and the moment isn't undone by it either. What actually exists, available right now, is the choice to live in a way that honors what that relationship meant, to treat the people still present with the care that regret keeps insisting should have been shown sooner. The punishment changes nothing about the past. It only steals attention from the living relationship still capable of receiving that same care today. There's a misconception worth clearing up before going any further, because people sometimes hear, "let go of regret," and quietly translate it into, "stop caring about your mistakes," or "never make amends." That's not what this is, and the difference matters considerably. There's a meaningful distinction between processing a regret and being permanently occupied by it. A person who has done this work can still take real responsibility for past harm, still reach out and repair a relationship where repair is genuinely possible, still hold real remorse for a decision that hurts someone. What's different is that the remorse serves a purpose, prompting an actual action where one is possible, rather than looping endlessly with no destination, replaying the same scene for the 1,000th time without ever producing a single new insight or a single completed amend. Picture 2 people carrying the same regret over having drifted from an old friendship years ago. The first spends occasional evenings replaying how it happened, cataloging every small moment where things might have gone differently, without ever actually reaching out, the regret functioning entirely as private punishment with no outward action attached to it. The second feels the same sting, but eventually picks up the phone, sends a message, and either repairs what can be repaired or at least closes the loop with an honest conversation. Both people cared, only one of them let the caring actually go somewhere. That's the entire distinction this misconception tends to blur, between regret as a closed loop of private suffering and regret as raw material for one real, available action. None of this lives only in the mind, and the body carries its own version of old regret whether you consciously notice it or not. A tightening in the chest when a certain memory surfaces, a held breath in the seconds after an old scene replays, a heaviness in the shoulders that seems to arrive from nowhere on certain afternoons. 2 small physical habits can help here. The first is noticing the exact moment a memory pulls you backward, and deliberately naming out loud or silently where you actually are right now, the room, the sounds, the temperature, a simple grounding technique that gives your nervous system something concrete and present to hold on to instead of the past it just got pulled into. The second is a short walk, ideally outside, taken specifically after a particularly strong wave of old regret, using the physical rhythm of movement to help the body release some of the tension that mental rumination tends to store rather than discharge. Grounding works here for a specific reason worth understanding. When an old memory pulls you backward, Part of your nervous system responds almost as though the past event were happening again right now, producing real physical sensations tied to a moment that no longer exists anywhere except in memory. Naming your actual present surroundings, the temperature of the room, the sound of a clock, the feeling of your feet on the floor, gives your body clear, immediate evidence that the current moment is safe and ordinary, evidence that tends to land faster than any amount of reasoning about why the old regret no longer matters. The walk works on a similar principle, offering the body a present, physical task substantial enough to compete with the pull of the old scene, until the nervous system settles back into whatever's actually happening right now. Bring it together slowly, the way anything durable actually gets built. First, remember that regret past its useful point isn't remembering, it's spending today's currency on a debt that already closed, an exchange that never produces a fair return. Then, recall that Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus each arrived from very different circumstances at the same essential conclusion, that the past belongs to a category entirely outside your control, and only the present moment remains genuinely yours to shape. Next, practice the pause, the honest question, the evening review. Not as one-time fixes but as habits you return to until the redirect becomes automatic rather than effortful. Finally, hold on to the distinction between processing a regret and being permanently sentenced by it, because the goal was never to stop caring about your own history, only to stop paying an endless toll on a road you already finished traveling years ago. None of this resolves overnight, and it wouldn't be honest to suggest it does. Old loops that took decades to wear this deep don't dissolve after a single evening of practice, and there will still be mornings, maybe for years, where a song, a name, a familiar smell pulls you straight back into an old scene before you've had any chance to intervene. That's not evidence the practice has failed. It's simply evidence of how long the groove had already been worn before you ever noticed it was there. What changes with practice isn't that the pull disappears completely. What changes is how quickly you notice it happening, and how much sooner you can hand yourself back to the actual, available, ordinary present moment once you do notice. Back in that kitchen, coffee finally finished brewing. Notice what's actually happening. The old room from 15 years ago isn't real anymore, hasn't been for a long time. It's a memory your mind keeps rendering out of old material, offering nothing new no matter how many times you walk back through it. Pour the coffee. Let this actual kitchen, this actual Tuesday, be where you actually are. And if it's the elevator instead, or the long drive, or the last few minutes before sleep, whatever quiet moment lets the old scene back in, meet it the same way. Notice it arriving without inviting it to stay. Ask the question that actually matters, whether anything about it can still be made different right now, and let the honest answer, almost always no, be permission to come back to wherever you actually are. The elevator doors, the road ahead, the sound of your own house settling into the night. You were never able to change what already happened. You were only ever able to change what you do with the time you have left, starting now, starting today, starting with this ordinary, unremarkable, entirely available morning. If this reached you at the right moment, there's another video close by that goes further into this same quiet work, the kind that doesn't resolve in a single evening, but slowly changes how much of an ordinary day stays actually available to you rather than quietly spent somewhere in the past. Take whatever was useful here, leave the rest without guilt, and carry a little more of today back into today, where it always belonged in the first place. There's no single morning where this work finishes completely, no final Tuesday where the old room stops appearing for good. But there is a quieter version of today waiting on the other side of enough practice, one where a familiar memory can pass through without pulling you fully back inside it, where the coffee stays warm a little longer because you were actually there to drink it. That's the whole practice, really, repeated quietly, one ordinary morning at a time, for as long as it takes to become simply how you live, noticing the pull backward, asking whether anything can still be changed, and choosing, again and again, to spend today's currency on today.